there. I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is my wrap up for the week that ended September. So I started the month with a book that wasn't quite a DNF, but I'm saving it for later, which is D.B. Jackson's A Plunder of Souls. I had just finished reading Thieves' Quarry, which is the book that immediately preceded this in the series, and it has that problem that a lot of mystery series have, in that a lot of the books are very similar to each other in structure. So even though the plot might be a little bit different, it felt really repetitive to be reading this immediately after that one. So I got a couple chapters in and went, I need to wait about a month or so before I finish reading this, because it's just not something you want to read back to back. It felt like reading the same thing once again. So I put that down and I got started on Pat Barker's Noonday. And this is the third book in the Life Class trilogy. Unlike those two, because the first one in Life Class, it was about these three main characters and some of their friends and relatives who were studying art in 1914, and then the follow-up, Toby's Room, was set in 1917 when the two male characters had both been injured in the First World War. This one then makes a huge jump in history and is set in 1940 during the Blitz. Two of the characters are ambulance drivers, and one of the characters is an air raid warden. I really was looking forward to this. Pat Barker is one of my favorite authors, and I loved the Regeneration trilogy. Both Regeneration and The Ghost Road are some of my favorite books in general. This was good. A lot of the imagery was really impressive. Their descriptions of these men who are now in their late 40s, remembering their youth during the First World War as bombs are falling in London, and that was very evocative. And the descriptions of burning buildings and of going to rescue people through structurally unsound buildings was all very impressive. As part of a series, I thought it was a bit of an odd choice, because in part you get flashbacks, and because it's part of this series, you sit there and wonder, is this a new revelation that we're having, or is this something that I should be remembering from Life Class, but I read it 9 years ago, so I just don't remember it? And that was a bit strange, because I feel like you see that in plot-driven series, like especially if you're reading one of those long fantasy series, but in literary fiction you don't see a lot of that because it's not so plot-driven. So that was a bit odd. I did like the evolution of the relationships and the complexities, and it was good overall, but I felt like I might have enjoyed this more as a standalone, just because I wouldn't have been sitting there wondering how it connected to the earlier ones, because with such a gap of time between this and the other two, it does feel like a different world, which maybe is the point, and that's sort of an interesting take, because I don't think you see a lot of that from that perspective, but I think it could just as easily have been about people of that generation during this period, and it wouldn't have been as distracting. Definitely thought this was good and one of the best things I read this month, even if it wasn't quite what I hoped it was going to be. So the next thing I read was Constantine the Hellblazer, The Art of the Deal, by Ming, Doyle, and James Tynan IV, which is the final collection of their run, because with Rebirth this series has restarted again. This wasn't bad. It was an okay story. John is dating someone, and of course that never goes well, and his boyfriend's kids end up in hell. That's not a spoiler. And they have to try and rescue them. It's a pretty standard story. I had sort of a dilemma in this, in that if it were a story on its own and this was a completely new character, I might have liked this more, because it does follow up to Hellblazer, the series that's been around for 30 years. You have that dilemma of this incarnation of the character lives in New York, and there's a lot of him being tied to the city. And if you're used to reading the series, you kind of go, well, I still see him as a guy from Liverpool who's adopted London as his home city. So it's kind of strange to have the framing of him having that relationship to the city of New York instead. And I think for this series, he's a different character, because when Hellblazer ended, he was 60 years old, and now he's back in his 30s, I think. So he's clearly been de-aged. He's not the same character. But at the same time, in my head, he's kind of the same character, and so I didn't buy the New York bits. And I also kind of felt like with the boyfriend, the fact that he had kids was workout for making him, he's a nice guy, we should care about him. And I felt like that's kind of unnecessary. We're supposed to feel sorry for him because he has the kids, but he didn't feel as well-rounded as a character. So that didn't thrill me. That said, I still like this a whole lot better than I liked the New 52 Ray Fox series. So, it wasn't bad, and if it was a totally new character with a similar story, I think I would have enjoyed this a lot more. But as Hellblazer, it does have the first, the rebirth issue at the very end with the new team, and he is back in London, and some of the old characters are back in there. So we'll see how that goes. So next up, I read Crooked Kingdom by Leigh Bardugo, which was the follow-up to Six of Crows, which I liked. And then I made the mistake of reading her Grisha trilogy, which is set in the same world in between, and I really didn't like those. And I think by doing that, I kind of hurt how much I liked the first book, because it's fun. It was a fun heist story. This one is a fun adventure story, but this has a lot of cameos from characters from the Grisha trilogy. And because I didn't like that, that kind of took me out of the book a little bit. That said, this is fun. The action flows really well. The character interactions are really nicely done. The character backstories are nicely done. One thing that sort of got to me by the end of the book, though, was that you don't get a lot of risk because so much of it ends up coming back to, and that was part of our clever plan, haha, which is fun for a while, but at a certain point there start to be bits where, character X is going to shoot character Y, and that's like a chapter end, and you would presume that that would be giving you drama, but because so much of the lead up is, and this was part of their clever plan, I just went, yeah, I'm sure that's part of his clever plan. So I didn't have a huge sense of risk, which towards the end was kind of killing the suspense for me a bit. It was still fun, it was still a book that I wanted to, stay up until 3 a.m. to read, but it sort of shot itself in the foot to a certain extent, because I didn't feel like there was a lot of risk. And in the end, as it turned out, there was slightly more risk than I thought there was going to be, but still not that much, which, again, maybe is an expectation that I shouldn't have had, because this is ultimately a YA adventure story, and I maybe shouldn't judge it for not being as gritty as I might have liked, because I think it does what it's trying to do really well, so I don't want to criticize it for being something that it's not, but the lack of risk did kind of get to me. The other part that I wasn't a huge fan of is that while I really liked the way the character development worked, there's a presentation of some of the characters as being more morally ambiguous, but you only get that in dialogue. So, for example, they spend a lot of time saying, "Oh, these guys, they're criminals," but most of the backstory that we get about them is about them being victims of fate. They come off more sympathetically. And when we get negative stories, or stories that would make them more morally ambiguous, it tends to be told but not shown. So, for example, there's a bit where somebody's, a clerk has been tortured for information, but we're not shown that happening. We're told in a different character's section. But you don't actually see any of that, so it's not as impactful as the parts where they're being victims of fate. So there isn't quite the moral ambiguity that I think the author was going for. But at the same time, I think that's not really what the aim was, so my expectations for that maybe shouldn't have been as high as they were. In any case, great fun. I don't want to sound too negative, because this was, really a lot of fun. And next up, Pieces of Hate by Tim Lebbon, who writes a lot of franchise fiction. He's written Star Wars and Alien and Predator tie-ins. This is his original work, and it is about a man who was cursed centuries ago and has to chase a demon through time. This is 2 short stories, or long novellas. I think they call them novelettes, actually. One of which is set in the American Wild West, and one of which is set in the Caribbean in the, I believe, 1700s, maybe. And they're both solid. I think it's one of these things, this was a concept where I'm sure somebody would have written a 600-page novel about it, but honestly this format was perfect for them. You get all the information you need, but not too much backstory, so I'm definitely curious about them. There's apparently a third story in this series, which I hope ends up bundled with a fourth one, because these are fun, and I really like the format for this kind of storytelling. And finally, a book that I've started but haven't finished is the final season, The Footballers Who Fought and Died in the Great War, which, as you would assume, is nonfiction. It is actually more interesting and less nationalistic than you might think for the subject matter. It doesn't get super in-depth. I'm only about half of the way through it right now, and it's not super in-depth into anyone's life or into any given military campaign, but as an overview, it's a lot of fun. It made me realize that I didn't know that much about how the shift from amateur to professional football went. It made me want to go and read more about that. There's a bit about how the War Office was at first saying, yeah, people, professional football should continue when the war started, but very quickly changed to saying that shouldn't be happening and that there should be more recruiting going on. And so there's a period of 6 months where that culture shift was going on, and I would love to read a book just about that 6 months, because that was really interesting. That wasn't something I'd known, and it was really neat to read about. It also made me want to read more about how the rules of football were codified, because there are bits in here where they're talking about one particular individual who was a goalkeeper, and prior to him playing, there had been more flexible rules about what goalkeepers could do and the ball handling. It made me want to read more about that bit of history as well. This isn't, a super serious book, but if you're looking for an overview of that kind of intertwined history, this is a lot of fun in it. And I'm not gonna lie, I started reading this because I was watching the Battlefield 1 trailers, which I know a lot of people have said that the First World War isn't the kind of conflict that is, naturally suited to becoming a first-person shooter, but it looks neat. That doesn't really have to do with the book. I watched that trailer 15 times and went, I need to read some nonfiction about the First World War to tide me over until that game comes out, and hopefully I can live out my Lawrence of Arabia fantasy. Is that inappropriate? Maybe. Yeah, so that's what I've been reading this past week. I hope you've had an interesting week in reading too. I've been checking out other people's September wrap-ups, and gonna go watch some more of them now. So yeah, that's it for now. Ciao.